All right, before we continue on working on finishing up our Harry Potter picture, let's just recap a little bit on some of these smart filters. So hopefully you are convinced we want to try to use filters smartly when possible. So we have smart objects with smart filters. Here's just some examples of what some of those filters are as a review. This first picture here is just the original image for my picture. But let's look at some of these. So there's the original, and then right next to it, this one here, I have the Smart Sharpen on there. And so what that does is increase that contrast around the pixel edges. So you can see that black contrast increased around the pixels. Okay, this next one here next to it, this is the one that we used called Glowing Edges. And what Glowing Edges is the one that takes the contrast of the edges, and instead of making the contrast darker, it makes them glows. So it takes the color from inside that and then glows around it. Okay, down here at the bottom, these are some that we used. So this first one here, this is the color halftone, which is under Pixelate. So before the picture looked like that, and then color halftone's going to put that there. Now it's always going to have color to it. If you don't like that color, you could always add an adjustment to that layer. The one below it here is Mezzo Tint. It's off to the right. Mezzo Tint is kind of a cool one because it is going to let you see those dots or lines. So there's the before picture and there's the after. And then over here in the middle, let me scoot this one over. This one here is the Stylized Find Edges. Stylized Find Edges outlines the edges with a dark lines against a white background. So it basically makes your picture mostly white, a little bit faded, and then takes and finds those edges, and instead of glowing the edges like the Glowing Edges one did, it makes the edges in black. So some people kind of use it to create sort of a coloring book sort of thing. So for instance, I could on this Stylized Fine Edges one, I could also add, and we haven't talked about this yet, but on the image menu, which is usually destructive, when we use it on a smart object, it's not destructive. So I could come here and do an adjustment here and make this say black and white. And notice it's going to black and white this here. I can hit OK, and it will actually show as one of my smart filters. So you can see that. I could even go and under here do a levels, and notice I'm doing these under the image menu instead of using the button. So they're not adjustment layers, it's using them like filters. So now I can take the levels and make these light areas lighter by pulling up. See, now we're getting more of a coloring book look, see? So kind of a sketch look almost. So that's kind of a cool trick that you can do when you're using these, is that you can go to that image menu and use those to add adjustments to your smart layers instead of adding adjustment layers, and then they just appear down on your list. Okay, and then up here in the top corner, this one is your Gaussian blur. This is how you do a natural background blur. Now if you were doing a motion blur, like somebody's running and you want to make it look kind of, that would be a motion blur. But this is a Gaussian blur. Remember, when you add these, you can always double click on the name of the filter in order to edit it. So if I decide it's too blurry, I can dial that back a little bit so it's not quite as blurry. On this one, I've painted on the mask so that you can see that my family members. But one thing that you need to know, notice that if I press Control T to transform, it says that smart filters will be turned off while we're transforming, which means if I transform this, it transforms my picture, but it does not transform the layer mask. Look at this. See how it's messed up now? So something you need to note about that, if you're going to do blurs on backgrounds and stuff, you need to make sure you have your layer in position before you add any masking work. So, get everything laid out on a page first before you start adding your filters to it so that you know where everything is going to be. That's why we put our Harrys on either side before we started to actually work on each one of them, because you want to make sure that that doesn't happen to you. So I'll undo that, so now it's back how it should be. So that's just examples of several of the ones that you have that should be on your note sheet. Oh, of course, there's also the liquify filter. So this is me. I've given myself a cheek lift, I guess you might say, and made my eyes bigger and all of that. Here's the liquify filter. See, there's my chubby cheeks. And then I'll turn my liquify filter on, and You can see what that does. The liquify filter is very intensive on the computer if you have a big image especially. So definitely not something you want to use on big images on a Chromebook because it will struggle. Like we're still waiting on it to preview. There we go. There's my skinnier face. But that liquify one's the one that lets you push pixels around or bloat or shrink pixels in specific areas using a brush. So there's your review of some slick filters that we talked about in the previous lesson. What we're going to do now is just finish up Harry and talk about a few additional things. So here this is in here. I added a Gaussian blur layer to this one, but I will show you something that we can do on that. So let's pop in here. You can be in Photoshop or Photopea. Actually, I'll go over to Photopea since I've already got that layer in Photoshop. So let me unclip all these. All right, so I've got my middle Harry selected. I'm going to add the Gaussian blur filter. So filter, blur, Gaussian blur, and then choose a level that's not too crazy. Like we don't want it to be crazy blurry. Okay, something like that is good. Now what I'm going to show you is how we can fill this mask differently. So you already know that we can take a paintbrush and we can paint in black with a nice soft brush and we can start bringing back the detail. And that looks fine, right? There's nothing wrong with that. But I want to show you another technique, okay? So if you have a layer mask and say I've already put black on there and then I'm kind of changed my mind, you can change the fill there's lots of ways, but I'm going to give you 3 ways. One of those is just by clicking on your layer mask and going to the edit menu. This works in both programs, edit and then fill. And then when that comes up, it says, what do you want to fill it with? So if I want to reset it, I'm just going to fill it with white. And there it is. Or if I wanted to, I could go to edit and fill it with black. And then nothing's going to be blurry. Oops, I'm on the wrong layer. I could fill it with black and then nothing's going to be blurry. It's just going to be blurry if I paint on it, right? So there, now it's not blurry, and then the areas that I paint on it in white would become blurry. So I could decide what parts of the picture were going to be blurry. That blur's not very sharp, so it's kind of hard for you to tell. There, that's a little more noticeable. Okay. The other way is to press Control and the backspace key. Now, if you press Control and the backspace key, don't do that yet. You need to find out what that means. You first off have to look at your color picker. So over here, I have my just standard colors going on. So when you press the D, it puts your default colors. You press the letter D too. In Photoshop, it's the baby squares. They look like a little black and white square. So that's going to make it pure black and pure white. Whatever color's on the bottom, that's your background color. So whenever you press Control Backspace, it's going to fill with the background color. So if I click on this layer mask now and press Control and Backspace, it fills it white because white's my bottom color. If I wanted to fill it with black, I just need to flip-flop these, press Control Backspace, it fills it with black. So that's another fast way to do it. Okay, the third way I want to show you is you can use your paint bucket or your gradient tool. So I don't know which one's lit up. I think default is gradient. So you've got gradient paint bucket. Now we're not talking about layer styles because we've done layer styles for gradients before. This is a special gradient tool that actually draws it on the screen. If I made a new layer, I would draw the gradient on the new layer. But what we're doing is using it on a layer mask. So I'm going to click back on my layer mask, which right now is black. And then I'm going to come up to the top to specify my gradient. You're just going to click it. And if you want, you can set your colors. I like to hit the drop down arrow and then just choose the first one, which is foreground to background. And then you're going to have those colors set to black and white, right? So if it's set white to black is show to hide. So if it's going to be blurry at the bottom, I want to show the blurry at the bottom. So I'm going to put white to black. And then I'm just going to drag across here. Again, making sure I'm clicked on my layer mask. I'm going to drag across. There's a funny little line that pops up. Now, how far you drag it is how far that white's going to go. So like if I go to his mouth, notice here my white gradually turns to black, and at the mouth, it's completely black. So I don't have to worry about the mouth part not being in focus. Okay, that's how that works. Now, if I go farther up, then it's going to stay blurry longer, but there's that transition area where it's kind of blurry and kind of not blurry in between. Okay, So that's white to black. That's typically what I use. Now you could do black to white. It's going to give you the opposite effect, but that's how you use a gradient. Now that's a linear gradient. A linear gradient goes from one color to the other color. There's also a radial gradient. So let me go ahead and press my control backspace here. Okay, so let's look at a radial by clicking up here at the top corner. So up here next to where you choose your gradient, you're going to see linear, that's the default, and then radial. And radial, it doesn't change the preview here, but what radial does, it goes inside out. Now if I drag inside out, it's going to put white in the middle and black on the outside. So I start in the middle of the picture and drag out. See how this does? Now that's sort of opposite what I want. I would want it to go opposite. Although on this picture you really wouldn't be able to tell the difference because there's not a whole lot outside of the perimeter there. But as we know, we can just click on our layer mask and press Control I, and it inverts the mask. And so now the middle of the picture is in focus and the outside edges of the picture are going to obey that blur filter. So understand the difference between a linear, which is going to go like left to right or corner to corner or whatever, and radial, where it starts in the middle and radiates out. So that's your two gradients, and that's how you use that gradient tool. And like I said, you can just draw gradients. If I make a layer, I could take my gradient tool and just click on here and draw and create that way. But you can't do much with that without changing blending modes. So, okay, gonna delete that. Okay, so now we've got that on there. And I'll just leave this one, but you can have some form of a blur filter on here if you'd like to. Next, we're going to make Harry a little more noticeable. So let's go ahead and, as we said before, when we're dealing with our smart objects, we can do our adjustments as filters. So let's go to Image Adjustments, and I'm going to do a Levels adjustment here. And I'm going to pull in to make this darker and more, mean, I guess you would say. So we're going to pull in on here. Oh, am I not clicked on my, okay, hold on. Let's click back up here on my layer. Click on my layer. Okay. Image, Adjustments, Levels. Okay. Now pull in. Here we go. Now we're making him a little more dark and imposing, and, it looks better with the overall look of the picture. There we go. I'm going to hit OK. And now we have a levels listed on here. See, there's a big difference between those. I think that looks a lot better for what we've got going on in our picture. Okay, so looking pretty good. Now we're going to hit one more category of filters that we haven't talked about yet that I call the Create Something from Nothing filter. Now we have to have something kind of, so we're going to have to make a layer to do these, but let's go ahead and turn all of our Harrys off for a second and come back down here to where our Hogwarts picture is. We're going to replace this background by creating what are called clouds. So we're going to create a new layer. I'm just going to hit the new layer button down here, and we need to fill in the layer. So one of the rules here to make these clouds work is that you need a layer, and that layer can be empty. So for this first thing, we'll just leave this empty. But it is going to base it on your foreground and background colors. So I don't have to fill this one in yet. It's going to create it on the layer based on these two colors here. So I have black and white. Let's make it not white. Let's do gray, some shade of gray. Okay, now I'm going to go to this layer, which I have not made a smart layer yet. So I'm going to right click it and convert it to a smart object just so I can control it. I'm going to call this clouds, if I can spell. Okay, and now filter render. So the thing you need to know is the render is the category of filter that creates something from nothing. And in Photoshop, you have a lot more options than I have in here. And in the newer version of Photoshop, which I don't have right now, you have even more options. You can render trees even. So anyway, I'm going to click on render and clouds, and then bam, it's just going to whip it in there. It's kind of like those photo backgrounds, right? So I can put these clouds in here, and that's it. I can turn all these back on, and I've got this cloudy background back here. Now here's the thing. You can go back and re-render it, and then it'll change the clouds. So it's just sort of random and arbitrary how it does it. There's also one called Difference Clouds, does the same thing, but does it just kind of in a different way. So there I've done the second one. Now I have darker, more imposing clouds. I'll take my first ones off, and you can see there's, it looks at the difference. And so very different if I turn that one off and use them separately. Okay, so anyway, that's just a simple way to render a background. You can go in with 2 colors and just whips it out real fast. And of course you can modify your blending mode. So if I wanted to have some of the rest of that show through, I could come up here and change my blending mode to various things and let some of the, rest of this show through, but I really don't want to do that on this particular one. Okay, one more. Let's put this on top of everything. So click up here on the very top layer and create a new layer. Now for this effect, the only other one under render in Photopea, it's called lens flare. For this effect, we're going to need to have something on this layer because most people put the lens flare straight on whatever it is they're putting a lens flare on. So I'm back over in my other one, but let me just open up, well here, I'll put my headshot that I have here. Let's get rid of all this other stuff. We'll get it back to whenever I first opened it. So here it is. I could put a lens flare in here by going to filter. Let me make this a smart object. But I'm going to go to filter and then render and then lens flare. And it's going to pop up and there's like a little lens flare. See it? There it is. And I can move it around. You have 4 lens types and you have 4 lens types in both programs. Okay. So you choose where you want it and you can modify the brightness of it. Okay. See photographers do this kind of stuff all the time. All right. And then you're going to hit OK. But notice it's actually going to put it on my layer. Okay. Now in here, it does a pretty nice job of just using it as a smart filter. For some of the other programs, it just doesn't work quite so easily. All right. So I'm going to come in here and I don't have anything to hook it to. Right? I don't really want to hook it to Harry. I want my lens flare to be on its own layer. So I've got to make a new layer for it. So I'm going to call it flare. And most of the things that I read say just make a black layer. So I'm going to make sure black is on bottom and press Control Backspace, just like we did on the layer mask to make it black. And then now we'll put in the lens flare. So filter, render, and lens flare. There we go. Again, you have 4 lens types in here. And just like the other one, we can't drag it over here, but you can just use this to move it around. Okay, so I'm going to put mine somewhere around where he's going to be able to, I'm going to put it at the end of the, what is it, magic wand or whatever it is. Now, I will tell you, by the way, if you let the outside edges of the lens flare hang off, they do get cut off. So you want to keep your circle like where you can see it or don't scale it down once you put it on its own layer. Okay, so I've got it. I'm going to press OK. Now that's great, except of course it's not, I can't see everything else. So what are we going to do? Well, we're just going to go ahead and change the blend mode, right? So now I did that destructively. My lens flare is its own thing. Okay, I didn't make this a smart object first. That's kind of bad on me. So that is a destructive lens flare. I can't edit it now, right? Not good. So probably I should do this again. Let's go ahead. I'll do it again. Control Backspace on a new layer. And then now let's convert it to a smart object and then add the lens flare. And as you're going to see here when we render the lens flare, now it's a smart object. And why is that good? Well, because if it's a smart object, we can go back in later if I want to change it. So if I change my mind and I don't like the way this looks, I can go back and fix it. All right, I'm going to hit OK. So now on my other one, if I didn't like it, I'm out of luck. On this one, I just double click it and bring it back up. So smart objects, smart layers, better to go. Better to find it now than later on. Okay, real flare here. Okay, so I've got my flare on here and now I'm ready to make it so we can actually see it. So now you can change the color. Remember we did talk about you can go to image and adjustments, and since we have a smart filter going on, it will add the adjustment as a filter. So I could go in and do like black and white if I wanted to and hit OK. And then we're ready just to change the blending mode of this because we have a black layer. Remember we made it black. We need to make the black invisible. Just set that blending mode of this layer to screen. Screen gets rid of the black, keeps only the light. And then, of course, I would take my move tool and position this there, something like that. All right, looks pretty good. I'm happy with it. And that's basically the gist of how to render stuff. So just remember, we start with, when we're doing the lens flare, we choose from one of the 4 different lens choices. We start with a filled black layer. And then if we want to adjust the color layer, we can add an adjustment. And then finally, we want to set that blend mode to screen to knock out that black part that we started with. That just makes it so that that part was invisible from the beginning. Okay, and that's pretty much it. I'm going to ask that you export this out and submit it to me so I can see what yours looks like. It does not have to be identical to mine, so it's okay if yours is a little different. But we do want to have the clouds. I want to be able to see your clouds up in there. So take a few minutes, fix it, do any changes that you'd like to do, and then export and submit this one so I can take a look.